So the first item we have is an administrative item. Iris Deng has been working on Istio Cuddle for quite some time, and she's had quite a few PRs merged. We were going to promote her to maintainer and put her in the owner's file. I haven't had a meeting for this before. Do we vote, or does we just get objections? How do we normally make that decision?
I think the question is there any objection? If no, it's basically passed.
All right, excellent. By acclamation, Iris Deng shall become a maintainer. A PR adding her to the owner's file has been done and will be merged soon. So I have several items to discuss. So the first item is some proposed Istio control commands that we want to make it easier for people to get sort of information about their mesh. So let me just give an overview of the stuff I want to talk about today. I have a proposal for this Istio Cuddle Inspect. I want to talk briefly about the status field for events and CRDs, which has been talked about for 1.3 but is not happening. And maybe we can do some talk about the control plane and issues for controlling that. So a lot of this work is about sort of helping the user. Other pieces are more about manipulating the control plane to help the user. Maybe they're in the realm of the operator, I'm not sure. So that's what I have for an agenda today. I'm going to leap right into this first proposal, the inspect proposal. So one huge frustration has been the number of mesh configuration options that affect a pod. So the idea is my service is running. It's running book info. I'm not getting through to it. I'm getting 503 errors or connection rejected before headers were sent, all kinds of different problems. I don't know why. And what I want to see is which Istio objects are manipulating that item. And there's no easy way to get this from Pilot itself. So Pilot might know sort of how to configure other pods to talk to it, but it doesn't really know what is doing it. So this is going to be sort of implemented as sort of an ad hoc command that looks up all of the Istio rules, maybe makes a snapshot of them, or just the equivalent of a get, and looks to see things that are affecting the services that talk to that pod, or etc. So imagining that you could apply this Istio control inspect either a pod or a service or maybe a virtual service, and sort of give you some of the kinds of things that you see with kube control describe, the name and the namespace, maybe the ports, but it would also then give you a list of the things that sort of are operating on that object. So it might get ports from the Kubernetes service. It might give you warnings if the Kubernetes service doesn't follow Istio rules. It might tell you if any destination rules target, and if what subsets destination rule defines. It might tell you what the TLS settings in the destination rule were, which virtual services talk to it. Maybe it would break down the virtual service more, telling you the match rules, the weights, any redirects. Maybe it would ask the pod itself what Envoy version is there. Maybe give a summary of the stuff that you get from Istio control proxy config, and maybe give you a summary of what you see from Istio control proxy status, a human readable summary of what Istio thinks your pod state should be in.
So Ed, this is great for debugging and getting information from the configuration point of view, the one thing that you talked about, which is little critical to understand, is that you are trying to recreate this information outside of the pilot. So you're trying to look at the Istio configuration and decide which of these configurations affect a pod. Is there a way to not do it aside from pilot? Because as soon as people change functionality in pilot, what will happen is this will start to lag.
So that's completely right, and that was my biggest frustration why I haven't proposed it so far. So the config sync status does come from pilot. Pilot will say that pretty good. This Envoy version thing, we would have to kube control exec in the way that the proxy config option does now. These options, though, mean totally having our own implementation of understanding of these Istio CRDs.
So there is a way of doing this also from pilot. Basically, so this is a new proposal. Basically, if Envoy configuration allows a slot for adding arbitrary annotations, then you can add that this configuration for Envoy is actually coming from this Istio high-level config. And then you can use those Envoy configuration tags to generate this. So basically, the idea is Istio CTL should always inspect Envoy configuration, and Envoy configuration should have back references to all the user-provided config, if that is possible.
So using breadcrumbs to go from the Envoy configuration back to the CRDs would be great. Is that present in 1.2 or is that planned for 1.3?
Someone else should be a better person to answer that question. But I think there were talks about adding some sort of information because we need it for telemetry and tracing sometimes. So I was hoping you can use that for Istio CTL too.
So that would be completely ideal. So if that was the case, and a great amount of this work, when the pod is the target, would be parsing that information, which Istio control already knows how to get from Envoy, and just parsing the JSON, and that would give us at least the names of the destination rules and the virtual services, and then whether or not we looked into them would be maybe the first version wouldn't look in, maybe a future version could look in. So
exactly.
That's great. So I will put a note in here. I didn't catch your name.
This is Neeraj, by the way.
Oh, didn't recognize your voice, Neeraj. So I'll just put that here as a note to myself to do. But you're right, the implementation should redo as little as possible. Almost everything that we can get from Envoy should come from Envoy. So the next thing about that, I guess, you're the right one to ask. So I propose that we should put warnings on if the Kubernetes items aren't sort of correct. And I've seen several proposals for how Istio should do this. I've heard people saying that Istio itself should be doing this, or we should be using code from Aspen Mesh's Istio Vet. Currently, Istio Cuddle has a validate, but it only validates Istio's own CRDs. It doesn't give you best practices if you pass in a Kubernetes object, such as a service, to tell you to follow the name convention. And furthermore, I've heard we want to get rid of explicit names. There's a work item to get rid of explicit names on services as well. So I wouldn't want to bake in a whole separate checker for this into the command line if that's going away in the core of Istio. So as for how this is done, I'm not sure what the recommendation is. Does anyone have any thoughts?
And it feels like from the networking group meetings, it's gonna go away, like you said. Additionally, I think if you keep the scope of STO-CTL inspect narrow, where it just tells you the configuration which is currently affecting Envoy configuration in a pod, I think you don't need to do this.
Yeah, so I agree that one possibility is to make this as narrow as possible, just to tell you what affects it. And then for things like this or things like this, you're expected to go deeper. I'm not sure what users sort of want. So if I make an initial version that just tells you what affects your pod, then it'll help, because I mean, a lot of this is inspired by conversations I've had on Discuss and other forums, helping people debug their situation. I'm always, well, let's see if we have any Istio rules with this, kube control get vs comma dr and all kinds of things. So having a single stop for a certain pod seemed like the best way to do it. So are people on this call favoring a narrow approach where we don't show a lot of details, but instead just show things like this and this? Or do we want to show more information, what subsets we found in that rule and what weights we found in the virtual service?
Well, I think detail would definitely help. Helpful. Maybe this, if there's too much detail, we can always do it with both modes.
Okay. Well,
I mean, so Lynn, I agree with you. At the same time, if you have the name and the namespace of the Istio CRD, getting that from kubectl is not a hard thing. The hardest part is associating an Envoy configuration to a human-provided Istio configuration.
Yeah, so the hard thing is Istio specific configuration, especially you're running this as a Istio CTL command. I think the name and the namespace should be given to user just to help them unique identify the thing, right? And then the other thing ideally would be user Istio specific. I think that would be really cool. And on this list, there's only like 2 or 3 that's not Istio related other than the name and namespace.
all right. Well, I'm seeing enough support for this that I'll maybe do an implementation, or we can work on one together if anyone on this call sort of wants to, and get some early feedback on what it would look like to have such a command. I think a command like this is going to help people who are debugging. Our current Istio Cuddle debugging tools like proxy config are too low level, and this is supposed to fit in the middle level between those tools and something that's like a
Yeah, there's also a status document. I think also you might own that one. I wonder how these two can be used conjunction by the user, because I almost feel like when I inspect a pod, I would also want to see the status for each of the Istio resources, and so that I know which one of them have been applied.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Is it possible that we do everything you talked about here, but we put it in the status of the pod?
We can. So
I think we can. It's just that there's also the performance aspect of it, right? So Galley is a Kubernetes controller, and it will need to be acting as a controller many things for Istio. If you make it update the status of pods, it becomes a controller for pods as well, and that may turn out to be a costly thing to do from a CPU or memory usage perspective.
I agree, and I think there is some overlap over who actually controls the status of a pod. If you have multiple admission controllers and multiple things mutating your pods, for example, I don't know if you want to put this as a pod status.
So you have a good point. And I had an idea for that as well. I'm going to jump ahead. We've been talking, or the networking group has been talking about status field and events for CRDs. I put a link here to this original proposal from Oz, and I had a meeting with him, and he actually has a PR for this work. What I and sort of the original thought that people had was that we could use this for several things for Istio's own CRDs. So one thing we want to do is when we make a new virtual service, we want to know when it sort of reached the pod. So that's sort of a status of has this rule been accepted and pushed and can be tested. That would make our own tests, for example, go faster. There is the idea of, is this rule globally valid? So a mission control validated that it was locally valid, but it didn't validate, for example, that it refers to a subset that a destination rule defines. With the new code and this pull request, there's like a snapshot taken in Galley memory of all the pieces, and they validate everything, and they put it all together. And that status could easily be put on Istio's own CRDs. It could also be put on other CRD or on Kubernetes objects itself, like on pods. But events can also appear. I don't have handy a screenshot for this, but it's easy to create events that appear when you do kube control describe pod. You could have an event that just sort of says, this pod had an envoy that rejected a configuration from pilot. That would be super huge, and I definitely want pilot to start doing that. And
I think there are a couple of potential pitfalls there, though. I just want to be, I want to make sure that we are kind of approaching this problem in the right way, right? So the first thing is there's a push for making pilot agnostic of Kubernetes, right? So the pilot will not be able to talk to the status of the pods directly, which means it needs to go through an intermediary, which might be Galley in this sense, in this case, right? Again, we go back into this model of now Galley becoming the controller for a lot of things, like a bigger scope than what it currently is targeting, right? So I think we definitely should expose this information, and I believe there's already events like some telemetry getting exposed, and we can also do Kubernetes events, which I think is cheap enough to accomplish. I'm wondering if we should also target status as well. So is this something that I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, right? So I'm just trying to figure out what is the best way for a user to figure this one out, like seeing that particular envoy is having trouble.
So this XDS reject thing, we already have a Grafana dashboard that shows it. Mm-hmm. And at the meetup, a fellow told me that his biggest problem running Istio in production is when bad configuration causes pods to start rejecting XDS. I mean, it makes your whole mesh feel like it's frozen because nothing you do has any effect because some other thing that you did earlier is making things go away. Whenever there was a reject, if we sent out that status, then we would, as an event or as a status, we would sort of see that this event started happening at this time, and that would be related to when we applied some rule. Maybe it would be super handy for people who aren't using Grafana to diagnose their problems.
Yeah, I think we can't assume everybody using Grafana, and even the Grafana he presented at the meetup, it actually takes time. Even he said to find the right query to work with Grafana to see that data takes time and practice. So it's not obvious for people learning Istio.
So there's a more fundamental question here around lot of different admission controllers and lot of systems actually affect a running pod. are they normally updating the pod statuses? Maybe there's other Kubernetes experts here who can tell me, like if you are a CNI plugin, for example, like I'm still confused as to why we want to update the pod status, especially if Istio feels like a layer above to me.
Yeah, I also with this like XDS rejects, that's a pilot bug. Like it should not be ever getting config rejected. I mean, it does. It happens. Like we miss some things, but I don't know that's something we should be exposing to the user. I mean, we have dashboards, and any like a trial user that doesn't use dashboards shouldn't be worrying about this, right? Like it's not a common case where you get a XDS reject. That's more like someone that's like a power user who is certainly going to have dashboards and alerting and things like that.
So the gentleman I met at the meetup told me it often takes them a day to figure out a problem like this, because it is deep, and we are reducing the number of XDS rejects we have. My hope would be that if we put the code in, it's never executed because Pilot always fixes up things before it passes them on to Envoy. But it is super nice to expose to the user somehow that their system has frozen up, and kubectl describe is the most common way people look at their pods to see what their status is. That's how they look for problems pulling, how they look for problems with live.
Right. But what I'm thinking is that, so Pilot's goal is to not have config rejected. And so in doing that, sometimes that means that internally Pilot is rejecting configs. Like we would have a gateway config, we would drop it and say this config is going to generate invalid config. And now that gateway is not tied to a pod. So we shouldn't attach it to the pod status. It should be on the gateway status saying,
exactly,
this was rejected. That's what like it should be on the Istio CRDs saying this was accepted or rejected, which I think is what Oz's proposal was, that is on there. I don't know that it should be on the pod.
Yeah, and Istio has complete ownership of the CRDs. So from an ownership point of view, it makes sense.
It should definitely be on the pod if we know which. It should be on the CRD if we know which CRD did it. So I've often seen these rejects, and they're huge. And I've seen a whole configuration being rejected because it referred to some secret that doesn't exist.
I think it might make sense to do some categorization here, right? So there's a set of configurations, user configurations that might be problematic, right? And it's a completely within the realm of things that Istio needs to deal with. And then there's a set of things, for example, Envoy rejecting configuration, which I believe, and feel free to correct me, like anybody can correct me here, is essentially a pilot bug, so to speak, right? So Pilot should not be generating configuration that's going to be rejected by Envoy, right? So that's more of a Istio control plane in distress problem rather than user configuration being wrong problem. And I think an approach for that category of problems in general might be more interesting, where we set up some sort of standard alerting out of the box for control being in distress, which might be much more interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I would be worried that if so say they get a rejection, there should be an alarm that goes off and actively tells them like there was an XDS reject. They shouldn't have to go and kubectl describe the pod, because they may not even know. Their traffic may be functioning fine and it may be not getting updates, and they start seeing more and more bizarre errors. And then finally, 5 hours later, they go and describe the pod and see that it was rejected. They should be getting an alarm immediately when it was rejected, which we don't really do. We have the dashboard, but we don't have any alarm set up.
Do we have any thoughts on how we might do an alarm?
I mean, Grafana and Prometheus both support alarming. I don't know if there's been any thoughts in making a set of alarms as part of the defaults.
I guess the alarm will be useful for operating environment, but if you look at developer experience, as they try to add their services to the mesh, I'm probably not going to set up an alarm, and I may do one service at a time, so I would be eager to check out what is going wrong with that particular services.
So Lynn, in that case, you want to know what Istio configuration is affecting my service, right? So I understand. So I don't feel like that's a pod status. We can give tools like what Ed has proposed, where they can use the tools to understand why their pod is working or not. And for the failure cases where for some reason the control plane rejects a config or the control plane cannot send down a config to Envoy, I think those are different things. Those
Well, I agree those are different scenarios, but also it would also affect user because there could be nothing wrong with their services. It just our control plane wasn't pushing the required data down, and they would spend tons of time to troubleshooting it.
That's fair. No, I see your point.
Yeah, because I personally hate that sometimes. Sometimes the solution is you have to restart the pilot. You have to go through proxy config, proxy debug, or the two commands. It's actually really hard to use. Sometimes you have to go through admin API. So I think we want to hide the user from that complexity so they can just using maybe one command to be able to tell them what could go wrong, whether they contact Aftermesh for support if they're in a supporting contract with you, or whether this is something that's wrong with their services themselves.
So all of this stuff should work together. So if I do implement this Istio control inspect, and it does follow the breadcrumbs back to the virtual service, and Oz's code does put events or status on that virtual service based on things it discovered, then I could put here status and events related to this virtual service. So instead of trying to parse what was in the virtual service and understand it, looking at the protobufs, I could just ask Kubernetes, give me all events related to this virtual service, give me the status field, and I'm going to display that. So the same way kube control described, it gives the status field of Kubernetes objects, Istio control inspect would give the status field of objects that influence a Kubernetes object.
Ed, that will not work in the case if the control plane rejects a particular virtual service, so it didn't even make it to Envoy.
Well, I guess that's true. If it never made it, often, well, I guess the first mistake freezes up those pods that get informed of that mistake, so that would be bad. But we don't have to ask Envoy for it. So the proxy, the Istio cuddle proxy status, it gives a diff between what Pilot has and what the Envoy has, and so we could ask Pilot instead to tell us what it thinks the configuration is on Envoy. We wouldn't have to talk to Envoy at all. We could say, Pilot, show me what you're sending.
Would it make sense to look at Pilot events directly? So, Pilot exposes like telemetry stuff, right? So Istio cuddle can actually scrape the telemetry and then create reports. So I think I think we need to separate the scenarios, right? So one scenario is the case where there's a production grade deployment with its own operator and then its own reporting and alerting, right? So that scenario I think is already covered from the perspective of Envoy rejecting configuration. Right? I think the scenario Lynn brought up is about this case where I do iterative development using some configurations locally and trying to do debug things and understand things, and I somehow run into this case where the control plane is in distress, right? So one of the things that I can do is I can use Istio cuddle to go and query the control plane components, Pilot or Galley, and see if they are in distress by looking at their telemetry. So instead of setting up a separated alerting mechanism, the Istio cuddle plays that role for the developer.
I think that is pretty good because, and then Istio CTL inspect can actually give you both the outputs if you want. it can give you the output of what configuration is currently affecting your pod, and if the control plane is in distress, it can just show you the output of the event stream from pilot.
That sounds great, guys. So I think we have some good thoughts on this. A lot of this is not stuff that we need to implement. Sometimes I wanted to make the other people on this group aware of what I'm seeing on the other working groups. One item that I did want to discuss that's just a pure issue is Kube Control Explain. There is apparently a lot of stuff in Kubernetes 1.4 that's going to allow Kube Control Explain to work better for CRDs. If anyone wants to take over this item, it would be great. I tried and failed on earlier versions of Kubernetes to get this in. It would be great to automatically transform our protobufs into open API specifications and put them into our CRDs. I was able to do that. It put the schema into the CRD. So you did Kube Control Explain, it would show you the schema, and Pilot could, or Kubernetes API could be told to validate the CRDs according to that schema. But I couldn't find any way to get the text to be shown by Kubernetes. I don't know if that's my skills at Kubernetes or if that's a limitation with 1.14. If anybody wants to take over this item, though, I would be greatly appreciated.
So something that's related to this, in config work group, Jason Wang on our side actually started doing some tooling work so that we can generate open API schema from our protos. And this is useful for adding validation at the API server level and doing some limited version transformations through API server itself. So our goal is to actually get these open API schemas into CRD definitions at some point. This might actually help with some of this.
I had put them in, and it couldn't, the schema was there, but either I did it incorrectly or it wasn't supported. I couldn't get the text in. I really feel users want to be able to do Kube Control Explain on Istio CRDs. So if the config work group could take over this issue, in fact, let me tag it right now as a possible config item. Oh, no, it is. So if anyone wants to think about this one, I think it should be a higher priority for helping people understand the system.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not entirely familiar what exactly kubectl Explain does with the schema, but I suspect adding the schema can help. And then the open API schema that the API server supports is actually a subset of the full definition, right? Full spec. Right? I think up until recently they weren't even supporting $ref, and there are certain limitations like that that API server simply doesn't support.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, if you try this manually, it is probable that you might, run into one of those cases where they simply don't support the open API schema that you entered. So it is, yeah, you may want to check see if that's the case.
Okay. So I started working on some of the control plane settings that users commonly need to adjust. I had a bug and I needed to take a look at I wanted to take a look at the access logs that Envoy can sort of make. I really had difficulty. So the first thing, I went to our documentation for access logs or for troubleshooting. If you look at them, they sort of say the logging is on by default and that it's easy to set logging up, and that you should control you should set access log format, but the sort of link to format, it was very confusing. I have been seriously thinking that we need some kind of commands, either in the operator or Istio Cuddle, for these operations like turning on MTLS, seeing if MTLS is enabled, turning on Envoy access logging, adjusting the access logging thing. We hide a JSON within a config map. It's we had YAML within the config map, which is in JSON. It's confusing and difficult for users to play with this stuff. What do we think?
I mean, we kind of already have some of it, right? It's the Helm options. You said -- global.proxy log file. That's global.
It is there. So you can do it through Helm.
Yeah.
So maybe I just have the wrong idea. Whenever I install Istio with Helm, I imagine myself as sort of reinstalling Istio. I never know if it's going to restart my pods for the control plane, or if I'm running a custom daily build, it's going to put me back to some other build that I maybe install with a template. I found it confusing to think that I have to reinstall Envoy to turn logging on and off. Is that the way we want to do it?
So is your case that you're going on here, they're setting logging and it's going to be on forever, or they're investigating a bug, they want to set logging on for 30 minutes and maybe even on a single pod and dig into the issue and then turn it off?
Right. So obviously, if they want it on forever, they installed it on. But, however, first, a user might be sharing their control plane with a bunch of other things. Maybe I just want to turn it on for the stuff in my namespace that my tribe is maintaining, and I don't have access to the control plane. Or maybe I just want to turn it on because I have a bug, and then I want to turn it off.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I was just for doing things like changing settings globally forever. I just want to make sure we're not reinventing the install process.
Right. So I don't want to carry a new Istio version in or reinstall with Helm every time I want to change something. And I want to first, the granularity of the Envoy seems wrong, and then second, the difficulty of reinstalling to set it seems wrong.
So Ed, this feels like a knob in the sidecar resource, and I'm saying that with a bit of skepticism, but I think Doug has a proposal out there for configuring or fine-tuning Envoy tracing via the sidecar resource. If that is available for tracing, I think it should be fair game to say, for a specific pod, I want to turn on access logging and then disable it later. I think, I don't know who else from networking meeting is here. I think John can answer if that seems reasonable.
That makes sense. I like that proposal, and I'm going to find it and link to it. Let me ask a second question. I've had a hard time making sidecar resources. There are almost no samples of them in our samples directory, or maybe there's none. I started making a Helm template so I could make a sidecar resource because they were too hard to write by hand. Would it be nice to have built into Istio Cuddle some way to make a sidecar, or some way to manipulate fields in the sidecar, like this field we're proposing adding?
Again, I think this might be better for Louis if he was here. I'm not sure how stable is the sidecar resource. Feels like a lot of changes are going on.
In fact, I was having a conversation with Louis just a few days ago to not specifically on sidecar resource, but specifically on some of the English configuration. Can we use it to use Istio CTL to simplify it? So I think it's along the same line, but not so much on speaking whether sidecar resources is stable enough for us to build into Istio CTL. But I think it's good to look at Istio CTL, how it can help user to simplify some of the configurations through YAML, instead of using YAML, just using Istio CTL command flag.
If I was doing this myself and I had a sidecar resource already, I could make a little one-line shell script that did a kube control patch to turn on a field in this sidecar resource. So I'm imagining if the sidecar resource already existed, the implementation of doing this would just be like a piece of sugar on kube control patch sidecar. So it's not like there's a huge amount of work in doing that if the sidecar resource is there and has a field for it. My question, though, is sort of, do we expect people to have sidecar resources? Should this creation of this obscure thing be a necessary stepping stone to turning logging on and off?
I think it depends on where you think the most common use cases. I think the most common use cases are globally turning on and off and then giving each service owner the right control to control what they want at the pod level. So however Istio's philosophy is that at the pod level you configure this to manipulate things for the Envoy sidecar, that's where it should live. Currently it looks like sidecar is that resource. And I agree, it's very hard to use it.
It feels like a dumping ground for all of the options that Envoy has that aren't elsewhere.
Totally agree.
So the group is not in favor of little commands to Istio control to turn control plane settings like MTLS and logging on and off. We want to keep using Helm for these things.
I think one thing that we may want to look into is I think if you're not familiar, Linkerd has this Linkerd tap command, which I've never used it, but I believe it just like gets like the live stream of requests going into a pod, so you just kind of like tap into the log stream. And Envoy recently added a similar tap mechanism that we don't configure at all in Istio. So maybe that's something we could use. I'm not sure. I haven't looked too much into it, but something to consider.
That sounds really cool.
I did
Yeah,
try
can you maybe link to the
nice.
documentation so people can take a look offline? So one thing about Helm, though, we were in a meeting earlier today. There was a lot of concern if we tie too close to Helm, which means we tie too close to Kubernetes. At the end of the day, a lot of people are looking at Istio beyond Kubernetes, so we need to be careful with commands that's tied too close to Helm.
See, that's a good point, Lynn, but my solution was no better because I just want to use the Kubernetes API to do a patch on resources. I've never used Istio outside of Kubernetes. How do we do things like manipulate CRDs without kubectl patch?
I guess not for sidecar specifically today, but certainly you don't want to limit that capability down the road if somebody actually had some type of API.
So I know a lot of people here like pipeline approaches and they expect things to be done by pipelines and stuff. I'm a big fan of like one-liner, crazy admin monkey type stuff working. So I have lots of little snippets, like I inject and remove sidecar annotations with kubectl patch and this sort of thing. I'm always trying to see how I can quickly get a lot of functions happening. And I just don't know how that works if I'm not using Kubernetes.
But even if you use Kubernetes, you don't have to necessarily using Helm, right?
Right. So I'm doing kubectl patch on you know, the Istio config maps and on the Istio mesh config and on pod annotations and all kinds of things that make certain people shudder. People tell me, no, I'd reinstall with Helm, and I'm like, no, look, I'm just going to patch this object. It's a one-liner. It takes 10 seconds. So we want to, I guess, support both use cases if we can.
Yeah. I just didn't want to tie to Helm, especially we went through Helm with installation, and now we're moving kind of away from Helm, and we start to hear more and more people that Istio is just for queue. So we're going to probably spend more efforts to make Istio work beyond Kubernetes.
Hang on. The new install process uses operators, so you are technically more tied to Kubernetes.
That's what I was thinking too. So I'm going to have a meeting on Thursday about the operator and the new installer and how they work together and how we can get the functions of the new into Istio CUDL and other command lines. How would someone with console be installing Istio with 2 control planes or something like that? Do we have anyone from the operator or the new installer here?
I know how the Maestro side is doing it.
Who's this?
Sorry,
this is John Mazzatelli.
Tell us, John.
So you're asking how the Istio operator sets up control planes in a multi-tenancy scenario, correct?
What I was wondering was how the operator, if we have a story for the operator outside of Kubernetes.
I don't think we do today.
Okay.
Well, that's a good question and answer. Somebody was just asking me this today too. So Lynn, are you saying today the Istio community, the multi-tenancy stuff is geared only towards a Kubernetes environment? Is that true?
No. I was saying the operator that's being implemented in Istio is only geared towards Kubernetes.
Okay.
I think what we're trying to figure out is how do users install Istio on the VM? If you look
I
at
didn't get that last.
So how do we
Say that again?
install Istio on a virtual machine? That's what we try to figure out. Actually, I just opened the issue feature request on that today. So you know, this doesn't support multi-tenancy. So we did publish a blog on multi-tenancy in 2018. And if you look at that blog, it's really using Kubernetes namespace to do Istio multi-tenancy, but that's not officially supported by Istio community.
Okay, so
I talked to Stephen today about what you do with the installer if you don't have the operator. And I proposed that the installer should have like a reference implementation that does the common operations in Bash. So just with the installer, which, I mean, it's Kubernetes deployment descriptors, but would be a Bash simple way to install.
I think the current assumption is that the Istio control plane is deployed in a Kubernetes cluster.
Right, that's the only doc we have, which is the only we support. But we got a lot of criticism on that. So I think the next part would be, can we run this on a VM? Is it possible? How hard it is?
So we should probably open a work item on the new installer to document what the plan is for VMs.
But the new installer is just a collection of Kubernetes YAMLs. That's all it is really. So it's like you can't run. yeah, it's like a Kubernetes specific thing. I mean,
Well, true.
Right.
Yes, I think this is a completely new feature. I don't think it's a work item under the current installer, as far as I understand.
Yeah, and it could be how we package, right? You don't necessarily run on the VM as Docker image running on Docker containers. It could be a big binary, or it could be 3 binaries, one for each component, or 4 or 5 for a control plane component.
Well, the tests all run as big binaries, so it should be possible.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we saw. The test framework Ozzy and Nathan build, it's already built some of that, but we're not exposing that to anybody.
yeah, there is a thing, I don't know how maintained or used it is, but it's called Hyper Istio. It's in the code base that basically does this one fat Istio binary with everything in one. But I've never used it or know if it's supported for actual use or testing or what. I've just seen it in there.
Right, so maybe that could be leveraged.
Okay. I didn't catch that.
Sorry, my bad. It's noise.
Oh, no problem. So I looked through the 80 open issues that the user experience group has. One is still targeting milestone 1.1. We have 2 still assigned for 1.2, and then we have 20 and 14 UX items, and many of these are dual areas, so we don't have to do all of them. But these are the items that have already sort of been done. Hopefully at the next meeting, Ram and I will talk more about specific items related to the sort of installation and of the mesh and upgrading of the mesh. So we've been frustrated by and we have very few work items for how to improve the user experience of installing and upgrading. I mean, Helm is sort of great, but we have these great new installers, and there's not a lot of discussion about how a user does that interaction. We've seen the architecture, how it makes 2 control planes and does a canary from the old version to the new, which looks and feels super cool. But what happens if halfway through that fails and that sort of thing. So I've been trying to understand that. So hopefully that'll give us some things to talk about in 2 weeks. Do we have any other sort of agenda items that people on this call want to present in 2 weeks? Does anyone have a UI to show us, or a project repo they want to show us that will help the user experience of Istio either install, upgrade, maintain, or operate? All right, I'll be looking for people on Slack. Do we have any other items we should discuss before the next meeting? Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.